Look, just to kick off, I imagine music was a huge part of the Howard household for you growing up.
It was, yeah. Mum played and sang. She'd been involved in musical theatre, and she worked on radio through IB in Warrnambool during the war years. And, we grew up inside a musical family. So we all sang. We sang as a family, brothers and sisters. Mum played the piano. She played organ at the church. It was. I thought it was normal. I just thought that's what everyone did.
That social conscience and sense of justice element that's been a huge part of your songwriting over the years, did that influence initially come from the music that you were listening to as a youngster?
To an extent, yeah. I guess, where does it come from? It probably came from everything on the mother and the father. And I suppose it really came... Dad was a great one for the justice. He was... his grandfather was arrested at the Eureka Stockade, so I think there was a bit of a family genetic trait of troublemakers, and but certainly people who... And Dad instilled in us a sense that no one's above you and no one's below you. And then, of course, that fed into the era, growing up in that era, slowly hearing things like Pete Seeger's Little Boxes, and hearing Peter, Paul and Mary do The Times Are A-Changin' and Blowin' in the Wind, and then hearing Bob Dylan's version, and then going, oh wow, can you do that? Can you sing like that? And can you be that raggedy? And so all that, that kind of era then, I suppose, really, it was a time of great change in the world, and it impacted heavily on me.
What do you remember about your very first songwriting efforts and developing a confidence in yourself as a writer?
I think it was women. It was women who drove me to write, I have to confess. I was probably 13 years old, and I don't think those songs will ever see the light of day, really, John. But it's that sense of wanting to be an artist, to express the inexpressible, to give voice to something, and inevitably then that leads to wanting to give, I suppose, to give meaning to something, not just, for art to be useful. And I was... What led me into the early songwriting, I guess it was then, as my writing started to change, was when I began to travel. And started to go I left southwest Victoria and went to Melbourne and out into the world and went hitchhiking around the country, and you start to come in contact with reality, the real issues and real problems that people are facing and dealing with in their life, and the injustices you see around you, and trying to give that voice and express that.
Which I guess leads to the creation of Solid Rock, and I guess it'd be difficult to talk to you and not have the subject of that song come up. What do you recall of the writing of that song?
Well, there's a long... it's a long story. I've been working on a book that I'm writing, and it's interesting to go back and try and understand myself, how I got to there. What's a kid from southwest Victoria writing a song like that? But I grew up, down here. There were two large old missions that were here, Framlingham out to the northeast and Lake Condra out to the west. So Aboriginal people were a fact of life growing up, certainly a minority. But they were there, and they were there for my mum and dad and my grandparents, and there are family stories that go all the way back too. And my mum and dad weren't racist. They were very, like I said, they were great people for justice, and they understood, I think, implicitly, that Aboriginal people had had a very bad deal in this country since colonisation. And because of the Irish background, I think that probably fed into that understanding, being a colonised people themselves. not to say the Irish were blameless, but certainly from my family perspective, I think there was a great sense of, we lost everything in our homeland, and now we're here in someone else's country, and they've lost everything. So I just went looking. I went looking for the young Aboriginal people I knew around the district here. Like inevitably you have to ask the question. Guys who are my age and were Aboriginal, and you go, wow, they were having to do it so much harder. And I come from a very modest background, really, with my family. My dad worked in a factory all his life, and so it begins that process of asking the questions about justice issues. And then I guess what I saw around me in southwest Victoria was people who had been really beaten down by racism, by oppression, by theft, by discrimination, by injustice, and then I wanted to find out, is this all over the country? Is this everywhere you go? And I wanted to know, was language and culture intact anywhere out there? And I inevitably drew me to Uluru, and I found what I was looking for, but I found that it was intact, but it was a bit of a quirk of timing to end up at Uluru, camping there in those early days, at the same time that people from Armida, Aboriginal people from Armida, were also making their way back to that country post-colonial times to reinvigorate their connection to that country, and we happened to coincide. It was a very powerful experience, and I saw the beauty of Aboriginal culture and spirituality, and that lit a fire in my head. And inevitably I could, the contradiction between the racism and the discrimination and the absolute beauty that was going on within the culture, I guess that's all embodied then in Solid Rock. That song, Solid Rock, Sacred Ground, is its real title.
Mm. Did the commercial success of the song surprise you?
It did. I know at the time when we came to record it and then release it through Warner's, we'd done a deal with Warner's, they didn't want to release it as the first single. They felt it was too political. But I felt that it was a really important, that be our first statement, and I felt it was important. And, so we released, we eventually convinced the record company. It took a bit of work, but we said, we'll release it as the first single. We thought it might get a bit of airplay, and we thought we might get to travel to Sydney to play. Little did we know that it would resonate so strongly with with audiences and take off to such an extent.
How much would you attribute the success of it to a matter of timing? Was it just the right time for a song like that? Do you think Australia was ready to hear that message at that particular time?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a kind of zeitgeist, it fell into a time. The land right struggle had really begun in earnest, I suppose. Post 67 referendum, the land right struggle had really begun in earnest, I suppose, in the 70s. Gary Foley and all the Tent Embassy in Canberra, and that had also filtered into my thinking as well. And so I suppose Australia was ready for it. At one level, there were a lot of people, I think it said Solid Rock. It had a great beat and you could dance to it.
Yeah.
It had great iconography. It was very Australian in character, and I think at a time where our generation were looking into our own history and our own country, not so much looking to overseas. And I think the use of the didgeridoo probably captured people's imagination to an extent. A lot of elements, I think, came together to And it's interesting because it was really popular. We were popular in places like Geelong and Wollongong and Newcastle that were very working class cities, but also in Canberra, which was, you would consider, a much more intellectual kind of city. So there were older people who understood what we were trying to do. In fact, Manning Clark wrote the liner notes. Professor Manning Clark, emeritus professor of history, wrote the liner notes for the album after listening to it, and we didn't think he would. But he heard something in there about, I suppose, these songs coming out of a working class background and speaking about, contemporary issues and historical issues in Australia. I think it just reached out. It was a time and a place, I suppose, John.
Yeah. What it also did was it gave you the platform back then to draw attention to other issues, as you did successfully with the song "Let the Franklin Flow." And that was one very much out of the old troubadour tradition of reporting the news and raising awareness.
It was. This is pre-internet, of course, or social media. And the issue had started to fade a bit at the time from the media. And I met Bob Brown in December of '82, and we'd been pretty actively involved. I've been pretty caught up in the whole Save the Otways campaign, trying to protect the Otways and Goanna. We'd done benefit concerts down Apollo Bay and to raise funds and raise awareness for that. So by virtue of extension, the Franklin River captured my attention, and it was so spectacular once we saw those photos. And I also carried the memory of the loss of Lake Pedder, which was an international tragedy, that we lost the goddess's bath. But Bob said I should go down to Tasmania and down to the Franklin and see for myself, which I did in February. I came back a week later. We were playing the Stop the Drop concert. I wrote the song within a week. We went on stage and sang it. John Schumann and some of the Red Gum guys joined us on stage, and we recorded that day, and that was the version that was released. So because we had the ear of the media at the time and it had commercial success with Solid Rock, we were able to get Let the Franklin Flow straight onto radio and help keep the issue alive in the media.
Do you think in this day and age today it's harder to raise public awareness of various causes through song, and when the general public have so many other distractions going on with their lives? You mentioned social media.
There's a lot of chatter.
Yeah.
Like you said, John, there's a lot of social media chatter now. Everything's instantaneous. And in those days, like you said, the troubadour notion of carried the news from place to place. I mean, troubadours were the original, media, if you go back far enough. And but at the same time, I still think song has a really important role to play. One, it has an emotive force, and two, it's the alternative view of history. If you think of, the victors tell the story of what happened in history, but that's the victor's perspective. And often the real story, and certainly an alternative story, will be told in the song and the songs. And, that's true of Ancient Ireland. It's true of, anywhere in the world, probably, Thailand or Vietnam or Australia or Aboriginal Australia, for that matter. So song still has a really, really important role to play because it distills thought. Why did Aboriginal people use song? Why did all cultures use song? Because it has a way of carrying memory and distilling story into essence that I think is easy to remember.
Now, you gave yourself a tough act to follow with Spirit of Place album. If you're in a position to approach that second Goanna album any differently, is there anything you would have changed?
I think it was a tricky time in the 80s. Everything started to go to MIDI and keyboards and sampling, and it was all happening around us in terms of... And I think we were really, in many ways, we were still a 70s band. And and I was never attracted by the nihilism of punk music. I loved its the fact that punk was so reactionary against, the big Hollywood, blockbuster stars living indulgent lives, and music becoming very schmaltzy in a way, and it was a great reaction to that, a really important one, essential. But there was something about the nihilism of it that didn't ring for me, didn't ring true, and I think I was just a lot more attracted to hope. Yeah, there's a lot to worry about at that time in the world, and there always is, and probably I think there's more to worry about now than ever than there was back then. But I don't think cynicism or nihilism will get us there. And at the time, I read a book by Kenneth Clark called Civilization, and he said at the end of that we can destroy ourselves just as effectively with cynicism as we can with weapons. And I agree with that. I think you have to be very, very careful with what you project as an artist and your language. And I think it's really important to be honest, but I think it's important to keep hope alive. And so Oceania was a tricky record. Mark Knopfler was going to produce that album.
Uh-huh.
And I met with Mark, and he was a really lovely guy, but he was caught up with Sonic Youth at the time. And so in the end we had to make a decision, and we decided to go with Billy Payne, who we'd met. We'd loved Little Feat, and it was Billy's first production job, and I suppose being a keyboard player, the album leaned more towards being a keyboard kind of record. And it's a bit of a victim of its time, but there's some beautiful stuff on there, that was, everyone just wanted us to do just do Solid Rock Part 2. And
yeah,
I said to people, it doesn't work like that. It's, I felt we'd made that record and we had to make a different kind of record. It took me a long time to fall back in love with that album, but I have, and I think one of the recordings I'm most proud of in that Goanna period is actually Every Passing Day. I think if we ever achieved a work of art, that was it.
After the disappointment of the band disbanding, were you up and ready for the challenge of becoming a solo performer right away, or did you slowly have to transition into that?
Well, look, I was smashed. Goanna disintegrating was a really, it was a lot of torment, really. And, it's a bit like being married to a lot of people and having to divorce everyone. It was tricky, problematic. We were in debt. Things fell apart. And so it took a long time to come to terms with that and go, how do I find a pathway as an artist back out of this? And I made an album called Back to the Track, John, on the Smell of an Oily Rag. I had no money at all, really, and it was done at a very young Sing Sing studio when it was only 16 track, and I'd be working midnight to dawn because it was the cheapest time. So it was really done on bare bones and no budget at all.
You did reconvene Goanna for this Spirit Returns album in 98. It's a fine album, but it, again, didn't receive a huge amount of notoriety. Were there plans for that to always just be a one-off, or was it disappointing that it didn't lead to more Goanna product?
Look, I think you can mount an argument to say that there were probably some very powerful forces that didn't want us around post Solid Rock and Let the Franklin Flow. There would have been big corporate interests that didn't want us around. We were problematic, and we were dropped by the record label after Spirit of Place, which was a massive selling album and made the company millions, really. I guess the problem. Sorry, I've drifted away from your question now, haven't I?
That's no, you're fine. Keep going.
What were you specifically saying?
The Spirit Returns album, was that meant to be just a one-off, or were you actually hoping it would lead to more?
Well, no, we felt it was a time to bit of unfinished business. We felt it was good to honour that memory. It was also a time where I'd come through that solo path. I'd done, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 albums, solo albums, and I was in a good position. I was in a strong position, and I thought Mars and Rose were not, and I thought it's a good opportunity to support each other and help each other out. And it was a beautiful record to make as well, and to give them the chance as well to show off their songwriting and their beautiful voices as well.
Yeah.
So it was a different kind of Goanna record. It was through the ABC. There's always complications, with the political realities in the background, but really proud of that record too. I think there's some beautiful material on there. And look, we were asked to reconvene and put the band together for 2 shows, 2 special concerts for the Melbourne Festival in 2000 and in 1998. And so that was a kind of catalyst in a way, those concerts. And we did the Melbourne Concert Hall for 2 nights, and it was a very, very beautiful thing to have done. But no, not commercially successful.
No. Talk about your songwriting. Has your procedure or the method, the way you go about it, varied much through the years? Do you write differently now to how you did back in the day?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have tried along the way to track the evolution of songs, but I can't enlighten you or your listeners, I'm afraid, John, on other than to say that I think it starts from a phrase. But I think in the early days, I may have reached for subject matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it would have been through what I was reading or through limited experience. Whereas the further I travelled, the further my knowledge broadened, the further my experience deepened. The more, I guess, I had to say and had to write about. And you got to travel through this country to realise there's no shortage of material to write about. And I guess I became less and less proud of what had happened here, how we came to be here as white fellas in this country, and more obsessed by what had happened to Aboriginal people. And the more I felt a need in the wake of Solid Rock as well to do something with that authority and to try and help give a voice to those stories, and to I really think we're on the way. We're still on the way to becoming a country. We're not there yet. We haven't even reached the starting line. And I think, Truth and Justice Commission will help us do that. That's that deep aspect of our national identity. Then at a personal level, the same. Your experience deepens. Your heart gets broken. Your heart gets made. There's plenty of food for thought there, and plenty of material to write about. And how do we make sense of this human experience that we're all living through? So you try and be useful and hopefully write songs that have a universal truth to them.
Is there a heavy editing process in your writing?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Every now and then, and it's rare, a song will fall out of the sky and land in your lap almost intact. But most of the time, what does Yeats call it? The Irish poet Yeats called it the hammering into unity. And there's that. You've got to really spot weld and knock it into shape and hammer it into unity. And, and you've got to be very critical, of yourself, and don't allow yourself to take shortcuts. Apply very strict rules to yourself, and in terms of standards. And when you don't, you'll have to live with that forever.
You've had so many other things happening over the years outside of your own music. You've produced other artists. There's your involvement in the Black Arm Band and even a children's book of Solid Rock. How important has it been for you over the years to maintain other creative outlets like that?
It's really important. I mean, what is your life as an artist? I could easily have been a painter and gone down that path as a young person. Or it could have been poetry, or it could have been literature, or there's so many possibilities at any given moment for all of us. But I was born like this. I couldn't help it. And I think I was born to be an artist, and all that comes with that. And, Rimbaud, the French symbolist poet, he used to talk about, the artist must take all the poisons of society and hold the mirror back up. And so part of you, I think there's a social responsibility to what you do, and it's a public service almost in a way, but you have to be, at the same time, you have to be almost cut off from the world and ruthlessly objective and independent, and fearless in a way to criticise anything that you think does not stand up to the blowtorch, and that can bring you into conflict with friends even.
Now, you received an Australia Day honour a while ago, which for someone who's initially made a name for themselves with songs that pointing out things that weren't quite right with Australia, what did that honour mean to you?
Yeah, well, that was I spoke to my partner about that, and so said, I don't know about that. And, lords and ladies and kings and queens, I don't really believe in monarchy. My dad used to say, no one's above you, no one's below you. I dream of an Australian republic, and I dream of an Australian head of state. I dream of a reconciled country with a treaty with its First Nations people. But, I knew that award would give me the microphone for 5 minutes. And I'd get the chance to say what I've just said to you now, and in a public arena. That's about all. Other than that, I don't care too much for awards. Really, that's not why I do what I do, John. So,
yeah.
So I look at it's conflicting, because at the end of the day, it's still got this strange connection back to Mother England, and I just think I've nothing against English people or people of English descent, but I just think that we have to stand up now on our own 2 feet. We're Australian. We live in Australia. We have to change the flag. We have to change the anthem. We have to, give ourselves the dignity of that we need if we are to be an honourable nation amongst nations. And we're not doing a very good job of it at the moment. And but there is a thirst and a hunger there in the generations coming through, to sort of hold on to these notions of old world ties. It's not going. We're at the bottom of the world, at the bottom of Asia. We're in an Aboriginal country, and we have to really come to terms with that deeply now and find a true sense of identity. And we're on the way to that.
There's always been a wonderful storytelling element to your work, and I guess apart from obviously a good story, what do you regard as the key element of good storytelling?
I suppose tell the truth. Be as dispassionate as possible in your expression, and be as passionate as possible in your exploration of the subject matter. poets know thy craft. You know, work hard at... Yeah, songwriting's a really strange art form. It's two things. It's music and poetry, and they have to actually fuse together. So it's quite a unique thing, and there's a degree of alchemy involved. But good alchemy also relies on good understanding and good knowledge, and you have to constantly feed the hard drive. You know, you have to constantly feed yourself and read lots and listen to lots and be moved and motivated by everything from the classics to, you know, to punk art or Dadaism or whatever it is, all through the ages. And if you want art that stands up in time.
How conscious have you been through the years of striking that right balance in presenting your songs, not only as a means of delivering important messages, but also as a source of entertainment? It's very easy for people to feel like they're being preached to with some singer-songwriters. I've never felt that way listening to you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, and you know, I know Bob Marley and Bob Dylan both talked about the early days and the point the finger songs, you know.
Yeah.
And look, I have to guilty as charged, you know, and I suppose when you're younger you get a bit point the finger, and as you get older you go, well, you know, not without my own failings, and so I think you become a bit more universal and a bit more inclusive, a bit more tolerant, and your songs reflect that. They're not as hard-edged, perhaps. But it is hard. This is a tough country, and you're juggling between making a living and raising a family and being an artist or an entertainer. And, you know, I would like to think of myself as an artist, but every now and then I have to be an entertainer. And ironically, the song that made me an entertainer and gave me such huge commercial success was Solid Rock. So I'm very blessed in a way. I'm very fortunate to be able to have that song as the torch I bear, the torch I carry, and I am constantly motivated by that song. I never take it for granted, and I always enjoy playing it. It asks something of me every time I do it. But it's a tough country, and sometimes you have to do gigs you don't want to do, but you know, you've got to pay the rent.
Yeah.
And you know, you try to minimise that as much as possible, and you mightn't get what you want, but you get what you need. And if I try not to be greedy with that stuff, because I think you do too much of that and you'll lose the gift of alchemy.
Now, you recently collaborated with one of your great contemporaries, John Schumann, on a song. Tell us about the process of putting that together.
John got in touch with me about doing a song, helping him, performing a song at the National War Museum in Canberra, a song that he wrote to honour Indigenous servicemen, diggers, and that, who the War Museum came to realise that it had neglected over many, many years. And of course, knowing families down here, Aboriginal families down here in southwest Victoria, there's a very proud history of service. Captain Reg Rawlings and Captain Reg Saunders. Got together with John, we recorded that song. It was great to reconnect with John and Hugh MacDonald, rest his soul, Hugh, and the Diamond Tanner Drover, and so look, we had a lot of fun, and we connected back in the day. We knew about Red Gum back in the 80s, and then when we did that Stop the Drop concert, and John and Hugh and the other guys joined us for Let the Franklin Flow on stage. So we kind of got welded together back in those early 80s on that song. So it was great to reconnect. And then John, we kept in touch, and then when Hugh passed away, I think John was at a loss. I think he felt he lost his best mate, and so we kept up. He came over here then, and we were working towards doing a show together in Adelaide, and we started mucking around with these ideas, and all of a sudden this song started to emerge, and so we kept at it, and we finished it, and put it down, and then there was interest from the ABC. Next thing you know, everything's escalated, and it's released as a song. But it was really great. It was great to work with John. It was great to work with him on a song, and the kind of rigour that that he brings to that as well. He's no slouch, and politically or lyrically, and it was really great to work. There's a camaraderie. We're older, we're less ambitious, less competitive, and look around you. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. Like the shortage of material. All the issues we fought for back in the 80s are all alive again, and possibly worse. Nuclear disarmament. The environment's in absolute crisis. Indigenous affairs is no better. We're fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and do we learn nothing, from the lessons of history? So a couple of cranky old men got together and wanted to make some trouble,
You went through the crowdfunding process for your last album, which so many others are doing these days. It must be so encouraging and satisfying as an artist to have so many people willing to invest up front in the creation of an album.
Something beautiful about the directness of that. Look, a lot has changed in my lifetime, John. I remember when we made Spirit of Place, you had to go to a studio that had, $1 million worth of equipment in it, if not more, in terms of hardware and now, you can make an album on a laptop. So much has changed, and but what has changed as well is the record companies, because it was so expensive, it had to be a big capital investment by somebody, and most bands couldn't afford that, so it had to be an agreement with a record company. They made the lion's share of the money. They took the capital risk. Whereas now you can have a really direct relationship with your audience, and they are the Medici family. They are the record company, your supporters. And there's something beautiful about that kind of directness where the people who love what you do support what you do, and they pay for it, you give it to them. That's a really lovely direct exchange between artist and audience. And I've always been jealous about writers and painters because as an art form, a painter or a writer works in a room on their own, and then they, it goes to the world or goes out to the audience, and it's a very direct kind of relationship, whereas because music has to be recorded and there's lots of technical engineering, electronic processes that get in the way, and it's a very hard thing in those old days to steer your vision right through to the end of that very mechanical electronic process. So I embraced very early on and loved the digital age. I think it's it's made art much more democratic, musical art much more democratic and much more accessible. At the same time, the digital world has also taken away the value of intellectual property. So I'm not quite sure where we're going to end up with that. Maybe it's easier to make, but no one will make any money from it. So I'm not sure where that all ends up.
Yeah. Shane, just before I let you go, upcoming plans. What does the new year approaching have in store for you?
Well, always working on projects, and creative director for the Return to Country commemoration concert with Mungo, the repatriation of Mungo Man's remains and 103 other ancestors to Lake Mungo. Then I work on the treaty project with some of the Aussie indie mob, We're doing solid rock within that project. Really interesting project. It's time for a new album. We're still working on mentoring. I've really enjoyed working with Yirmal, a young upcoming artist from Yirrkala who's an extraordinary talent, really, and a beautiful spirit. So I'm sure he'll rock our world, and it's beautiful to watch Aboriginal artists now telling their own story. I don't have to sing songs write songs like I did in the past. There's a whole army of Aboriginal artists coming through now who are so gifted and will take that story to a new dimension. Really just, I'd love to see Goanna do something before we're all finished up, and that's easy to say. It's much harder to do, but that would be a lovely thing, I think, to round that off, if for no other reason than our own sense of a circle complete. What's in front of me? I'd have to look at the calendar, to be honest.
That's all right.
All I know is that life is incredibly busy.
Yeah.
Every day is filled with, possibility and a new adventure. I go to Yakandanda to sing up there. I've written a song for them. They're about to go off the grid, to have their own mini grid, and they're about to go off the power grid as a township, which is incredibly exciting.
Wow, yeah.
Great community, doing great things. There's always beautiful, surprising, varied and interesting things to do. But, at the end of the day, like everybody else, it's hard enough to get the dishes done, hey? Get the lawn mowed, keep things moving, and try and find a bit of space to wander into the wilderness or the bush or the beach, and remember that we are human beings having an incredibly spiritual existence, and it's extraordinary that the universe should create us to look back at the universe and admire it.
So true. Hey Shane, thank you so much for being so generous with your time this afternoon, and thank you for decades of wonderful, thought-provoking songs, and we look forward to many more.
Great, thanks John. Thanks for taking the time and the great questions.
All the best.
See you, mate.
Cheers.